All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome you if this is the first time that you're joining us. And if this is not the first time, then it's a very special privilege to welcome you back to today's event, which of course is also opening the winter semester here at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. And this is also the first event in our faculty graduate student seminar series. Today we have the pleasure of providing you with the presentations given by two of our graduate students. One of them is Dana Gold and Minghui. And let me just give you a brief introduction to each of them, and then I will yield the floor first to Dana and then to me. Dana Gold is visiting us from the Political Science Department at the University of Western Ontario, but she is an affiliated researcher at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, working very hard on various projects, and today she's going to provide a presentation based on her doctoral dissertation research. Now, her doctoral research combines concepts from the social and cognitive sciences in investigating how educational institutions in Israel construct and perpetuate representations of the other through textbooks and curricula. The title of her presentation is therefore not surprising: Who is the Other? Exploring representations of Palestinians in the Israeli education system through the use of institutional theory. So Dana is going to engage us for about 30 minutes, and then we'll yield the floor to Minghui, who is a doctoral student at the Department of Religion. And we are very grateful for the Department of Religion to actually collaborate with us and to provide us with the home for today's event. Ming, as I mentioned, Ming is a PhD student within the Judaic Studies program of the Religion Department's offerings. She finished all her exams, all her courses, and I'm very happy to say also that Ming is a recipient of the Montefiore Graduate Scholarship Program that we are running from the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. The title of Ming's dissertation, but today's presentation in particular, is The Origin of the Harbin Jewish Community, and she will be looking in particular between the years of 1898 to 1917. Also very important years, of course, in overall Zionist history, but Ming's focus will be on China today. So without further ado, I do want to also, of course, remind you that we have still food on the table, pizza, lots of pizza to be had. So don't be shy. But now I'm going to turn the floor over to some intellectual food to tease your appetite no further. Dana, the floor is yours. I will remind you 5 minutes before your time is up, and then we'll take questions, and we'll have a Q&A after both students have finished their presentations. So, Dana?
Thank you, Dr. Michelini, for the kind introduction and the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here today. Some of you might already know me since I've been affiliated with Concordia over the past semester. And it's been really great being able to collaborate with other scholars that are in Israel studies or similar disciplines. So I've had a great experience so far, and thank you all for coming on this cold and rainy day. I appreciate that. And I look forward to any questions you might have at the end of our presentations or any suggestions moving forward. So as Dr. Nicolini told you, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Western Ontario. And this presentation is based upon several chapters that I've pieced together. So my research is interdisciplinary, as Dr. Nicolini mentioned. And I'm interested specifically in the process of institutionalization in the Israeli education system. So how educational sources are approved, rejected, who is in charge, for making these decisions, what committees are responsible, and some of these answers are not clear-cut, which is why I'm interested in contributing to this literature. And throughout my research, I have some idea of how this happens, but I'm still trying to get more information. So, as I mentioned, this is part of my my doctoral research that will fit in with that. So before I move forward, just so you can understand the context. So as I mentioned, this is several chapters of my dissertation. So the first one is analyzing institutional literature within the social sciences. So even though I stem from the discipline of political science, I'm also interested in what other fields have to say, such as anthropology, sociology, psychology. I feel like each field in itself has a lot to bring to this discussion. And then the second chapter is institutionalization within the cognitive sciences. So I don't claim to be a cognitive scientist, but I'm really interested in learning more about this field and what the mind has to say about the process of institutionalization and how it impacts public policy and the education system in Israel. And then I bring in the case study, which is examining representations of the other in the Israeli education system. So this refers mainly to Palestinians and how they're portrayed through educational sources. And I come up with several themes based on the literature, and then talk about my contribution. So I'll try not to focus too much on the theoretical aspect of this. As I mentioned, provide some context, since I know you're all coming from different disciplines, and just so you can see how I kind of bring the theory and the case together. So institutions are commonly recognized, acknowledged, and some examples are the family, religion, places of worship, and a big one, the education system, which is why I'm interested in it. But one issue is some scholars have argued that it's easier to gain agreement about what institutions are than what they're not, and it's difficult to come up with a unanimous definition. So based upon the literature, I've come up with a three-part definition that I kind of employ throughout my doctoral dissertation. So the first is that institutions are largely social constructions, and that they participate in the social construction of reality, which is a concept coined by Berger and Luckman. And obviously, this definition wouldn't apply to every case, but I'm applying it specifically to Israel, and I think that it works quite well, which I'll explain later. So what I mean by social construction is that institutions are not natural, but they're created for a specific purpose, to serve a specific purpose in society. So if you look back to the literature about the social contract and the idea of creating order within a society, so it's that kind of concept that institutions exist within a society for a specific reason to serve the needs of the people. And second, tying in with the first, is that they're perceived as being a reality that is taken for granted. So institutions are so embedded within our society and accepted and legitimized that we often don't question them unless they're either an inconvenience to us or something out of the ordinary. And lastly, institutions have a tendency to persist, although this does not imply that they are permanent. So what makes all of the examples I listed institutions is that they're widely accepted and legitimized within a society, and as a result of this, they have a tendency to persist and they're long-lasting. But as I mentioned, because they exist for a specific purpose, if the needs change within a society, then they can either be replaced with a similar institution, or they can change to some form. So I'll explain later on how this relates to the case, which is the Israeli education system, and how this definition kind of fits in. So specifically, the institutional literature and the social sciences, what I found really interesting is that the economics field had a lot to add to this discussion, and they focus more on the formal dimensions of politics and institutions. So this is kind of just a summary that I put together based on all the literature that I found, because there is a lot. So basically, on a basic level, it can be divided into old institutionalism versus new institutionalism. So essentially, looking at the formal dimensions of politics versus more informal dimensions, and as the concepts, as you can see just by reading them, you can kind of group into older theories versus newer theories that have come up more in the past few decades. And within new institutionalism, I've come up with 3 different theories, analyzing them as to why they might be important to my case, and then I choose one and argue why it's superior, and specifically to the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli education system. So the behavioral approach stems mainly from political science, and behavioralists, they adopt a deductive methodology where actors are assumed to be selfish, utility maximizing individuals. And I think this theory has a lot to offer. But I think it's simplistic in a way because if you're looking specifically at the case of Israel, which is kind of in a constant state of war, I think that this approach has flaws in some ways because it assumes that actors will always act in a rational manner, their utility maximizing, but in a state of war, you can't always assume that individuals will act in a certain way and be able to weigh pros and cons before making decisions when, they might be living within an existential crisis that we might not face in other countries. So the second is the historical approach. So this one looks both to formal and informal dimensions of politics and structures. So informal in the sense that they might also look at, shared beliefs, norms, and values. And I also think it's a strong approach, but one issue is that it doesn't account well for change. And I'll speak about my research in more detail later on, but one thing I'm interested in with my dissertation is specifically the education system in Israel in the past 20 years. And in one chapter, I tried to compare the 1990s versus presently, how the education system has changed, the leaders that are in power, certain decisions that were implemented, and as a result, what influence this had on the education system and the wider society. And I find that the historical approach doesn't account well for change and different contexts. So that leads me to the third theory, which is what I also apply throughout my thesis, which is the sociological approach, obviously stemming from the field of sociology. And I think it's important because it talks about the interaction between institutions and environment, and it stresses that institutions can't be analyzed in isolation. So specifically in the case of Israel, because as I mentioned, it's in a constant state of war, one can't really examine the education system without looking at what's going on in the wider society and how this impacts the education system. And this is a big part of my thesis, trying to understand how the two interact, how this happens. So that's where the process of institutionalization comes in, looking at kind of public policy and the society and how it impacts the education system. So I won't talk too much about this, but just to kind of bring up why I'm interested in the cognitive science. So as I mentioned, cognitive science deals a lot with the study of the mind and mental processes. So it has to do a lot with psychology's cognitive revolution in the past few decades, which made it more acceptable for scholars from the social sciences to kind of step over their limits and boundaries and embrace new approaches. And it's kind of tough sometimes for me because I know that scholars from the social sciences and the natural sciences, they're kind of, defensive of their own position, and sometimes it's difficult to step outside that boundary when the two seem like they might be opposing, but in many ways they are complementary. And just looking at, so I employ the study of mental representations as one concept from the cognitive sciences and apply it to my own research, looking at how Israelis kind of create mental representations and how their ideas are perpetuated. So at a young level, so I'm interested mainly in the junior level because, so it's in Israel, I think it's grade 7 to 9, so it's before high school, because the education system has most of an impact on children before high school, and that's been widely documented because they're more vulnerable and their ideas are more susceptible to change and heavily influenced. So I'm interested in this period and how their mental representations are created about the other, which are mainly Palestinians, and how they're constructed and kind of how it influences them later on. And one talk which I'll be giving later in the summer is about how the Israeli military influences the education system, and these kind of tie in together. So from a young age, children have this idea that they're going to become soldiers when they're 18, and this obviously influences like how they view other groups within the society and their educational experience as a result. So these are two other concepts, which I won't go into a lot of detail, but essentially there are a few scholars who talk about the relationship between institutions and the mind and how one influences in the other and vice versa. So Douglas North, who's an economist, says that the relationship between mental models and institutions is an intimate one. So I just find it interesting that there's a lot of literature already out there about combining these concepts from different disciplines. And I think the mind needs to be included much more into this discussion. So one example, so Sean Gallagher says that mental institutions are not only institutions with which we accomplish certain cognitive processes, but also that without them such cognitive processes would no longer exist. So he talks about the legal system as an example of an institution that guides our thinking about what we can or cannot do, but without it, we couldn't think in these ways that institutions make possible. So it talks about this dynamic between individuals and institutions, about how they're not social constructions, they're not natural, and this kind of, has to deal a lot with the role that the mind plays. So the next one. So this is the case study that I focus on. So exploring the role of the other in the Israeli education system. So in my literature review for my thesis, that's the only chapter where I focus pretty evenly on both cases, looking at the Israeli side, how they portray the Palestinians, and the Palestinians, how they portray the Israelis. And there is a lot of literature in both cases, but my thesis focuses mainly on the Israeli education system, but I think it's important as a starting point to look at how both sides might have a role to play, might be responsible for perpetuating harmful representations of the other, and this kind of opens the discussion for looking at the Israeli case specifically and the institutionalization process which takes place. So based upon the literature, there were 3 common themes that I saw. And one of my contributions to my thesis is that I find that the literature on institutions and even the literature on the Israeli education system kind of minimizes the cognitive role. So that's why I'm interested in bringing literature from different perspectives together and adding my own information as well. And so my research relies on primary and secondary sources. So the primary sources is I've spoken to educators in the Israeli who have been past teachers in Israel, and they've kind of confirmed the literature that I've already came up with, and they tell me about the problems that the education system faces. But Dr. Nicolini has put me in touch with someone at the Ministry of Education, which will be very helpful in finding out more information. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the institutionalization process is what I'm interested in. And one chapter, so I look at the kind of hierarchy within the Ministry of Education to discern which committees or groups might be responsible for implementing certain decisions. So as I mentioned, I have some idea of this process, how it works, but speaking with the Ministry of Education obviously will be helpful in gaining more information. So in this chapter, there are 3 themes, as I mentioned. So the first was conflicting discourses, and the prime example I saw was the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So this is the same event will be viewed drastically different in Israeli textbooks and in Palestinian textbooks, obviously. So in the former, it's seen as more of a celebration. So the Jews finally had their own state. The refugees from the Holocaust finally had a sense of security, and in the Palestinian textbooks, it's seen kind of as a disaster. So there are several events or points in time that I've looked at which have shown opposing discourses, and this creates one problem in trying to create a unified narrative, and it's almost impossible in a way because of these 3 themes or points that I've made. So the second is erasing and overlooking historical narratives. And as I mentioned, I employ literature from the cognitive sciences. And one concept is the idea of mental maps. So mental maps have been defined as ideological constructs that may have little to do with geographic evidence, but that reflect individual or societal perceptions or reflections of the world. So in a sense, another scholar argued that maps do not reveal but produce reality. So even though textbooks on both sides would have the outline of the State of Israel, the cities would be called by different names. Some cities might be erased completely or overlooked completely, and this has it essentially illustrates that maps have a lot of meaning that, and it's more than meets the eye. So this also is an issue within both of the educational systems in how the other is represented or portrayed. And the third is instances of blame. So both sides in some way have been responsible for victimizing their own side and blaming the other side. And there are a lot of examples which widely document this. And these are themes that I've come up with based on the literature I've been looking at about the education system, but it also is kind of symbolic of the wider society in both cases, because obviously, I think it was Daniel Bartal says that that educational texts reflect societal beliefs. So obviously these narratives, these discourses and ways of thinking come from somewhere. So they reflect societal beliefs in the sense that mental representations created by children are constructed for a specific purpose, and the side of each narrative will be different, and essentially both sides are kind of raised viewing the other in a largely negative way. So there were two projects I found interesting. So the first was a 2013 study entitled Victims of Our Own Narratives, led by Professor Bruce Wexler. So you might have heard of it. It was fairly popular a few years ago, and essentially for this project there were Israeli and Palestinian researchers who translated and analyzed hundreds of textbooks on both sides of the conflict, and their main conclusion was that both sides are equally guilty in portraying the other in a harmful and negative manner. And this study received a lot of backlash, particularly from the Israeli ministry, because they didn't like the fact that they were being held to the same standard as the Palestinians, and essentially being told that they're just as equally as responsible for portraying the other in a negative light, and essentially just as equally as responsible as to why there's no peace. So this kind of led me to be what was one of the reasons that led me to be interested in the education system, just because of the findings that they came up with and also the criticism that was received. And the second is PRIME, led by Dan Bar-On and Sami Adwan. So PRIME stands for the Peace Research Institute in the Middle East. So in 2001, they presented a project which included a joint school textbook developed with Israeli and Palestinian researchers. And they argue that textbooks are the formal representations of the society's ideology and ethos. They impart the values, goals, and myths that the society wants to instill onto the new generation. So this is similar to Daniel Bartal's definition when he says that educational texts reflect societal beliefs. So I wanted to bring the theory and the case together just to show how they fit together and provide context. So as I mentioned, the sociological approach I found was the strongest of the three within the institutional literature, which looked at the importance and recognizing the importance of the interaction between institutions and individuals and the environment. And I'm also interested in why there hasn't been a lot of reform in the education system, because these studies have existed for a number of years saying these are all the problems that exist, and why hasn't there been a lot of change. And this has to do, as I mentioned, a lot with the perceptions of the wider society, and these are influenced within the textbooks. So one thing that I've also been looking at is some scholars, even in Israel studies, look at states of conflict after war and how their educational texts have changed. So for example, Germany and France after World War II, obviously the textbooks were changed afterwards to become more inclusive, and some literature that I've been looking at is how peace in the region might take place, or peace in the region might need to take place before the education system can be modified. So that's just one thing which I'll bring up in the next slide as well. And there are two other points. So obviously Israel was built, is a Zionist state and was built on Zionist ideals, and in such a way it's favored at the expense of the other. So the two are kind of a paradox. So even though Israeli leaders might want to make the education system more inclusive, it's difficult in some ways when Israel is a Zionist state, obviously, and it exists as both a Jewish and democratic state. And this is not something I want to get into because it's obviously very political, but it's just something to think about when examining the education system and how can it be inclusive while maintaining its identity. Is that possible? And some people say it's not. There are people on both sides of the argument. So one example, which I think ties in well with these ideas, is in December 2015, there was a novel introduced in a few Israeli schools, which talked about the relationship between an Israeli woman and Palestinian man. And after a few months, it was banned by the Ministry of Education because they said that it threatens Jewish identity. So this is something that I'm interested in looking, as I mentioned, how the education system might be more inclusive or might be reformed in such a way where the other side might be portrayed in a different light. So in my thesis, in my research, I provide a few solutions. Obviously, I'm not trying to provide a solution to the conflict because that would be too simplistic. But I'm just interested in opening a discussion and seeing how we can move forward because this is something that is very close to my heart, and I'm passionate about this topic and always want to learn more. So I would like to see more interdisciplinarity between scholars, and I think even outside of academia, just kind of more discussion and open-mindedness about these issues. Another area that has been looked at is multicultural and multilingual education. So essentially schools which combine both Arab and Jewish students. And multilingual education refers specifically to schools in Israel where Hebrew and Arabic are the main languages of instruction. These schools involve two homeroom teachers, a Palestinian and an Israeli. They jointly lead classes, and each school is co-directed by a Palestinian and Israeli principal. And as I put in brackets, it's kind of limited in the sense that it hasn't widely been accepted, and it'd be interesting to see, what the future holds and what would happen to such an idea. And the third, obviously, nothing new, is increased discussion among Israelis and Palestinians. So there was one study by Ifat Maoz, which is called The Dialogue Between the Self and the Other, and he led a few discussions over multiple weeks, and it was led by an Israeli and Palestinian student. And discussion obviously led to a lot of tension between the two, but this article argues that it led to the process of questioning one's own self as well as the perception of the other. So increased discussion, as difficult as this might seem, might help or reform the education system in some way in which Israelis and Palestinians might be able to see the other side in a different light. I think that was everything that I had. And so thank you for listening to my presentation, and I welcome any questions.
30 minutes. After 25 minutes, I will give you a sign. Okay.
I'm in the religion department, my topic is the origin of the Harbin Jewish Community under Russian domination, 1898 to 1917. There will be three parts of my presentation. First is about the foundation of the city. It's about Harbin's early history, Chinese Eastern Railway and the city, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. And the second is the foundation of the Harbin Jewish Community, the Kahar in China, Jewish rights in Harbin, and the final section is the conclusion, the significance of the Harbin Jewish Community. This is the here is Harbin. This is this is China. Beijing is around some here, and Harbin, and this is Russia, East Europe, Russia, and Korea and Japan. That's basic map. So first, the Harbin's early history. Harbin is the capital and the largest city of Heilongjiang province in northeastern China. This area was traditionally called Manchuria. Harbin is located in the center of Manchuria, at the southeast of Songnan Plain, which is full of natural resources. Also, the main branch of Songhua River flows throughout Harbin. Harbin's predominant geographical location decides its significance in Chinese history. Chinese trace Harbin's history to ancient times in their textbook and the excavation of the museum with archaeological evidence. Around the year 1890, there were hundreds of villages around Harbin, such as Fujiadian and Sijiazi. The area of Xiangfang had more than 200 households. In the east of Xiangfang, it appeared some manufacturers, food markets, carriage shops, and hotels, and so on. Xiangfang was also the first zone that was occupied by Russians when they discovered Harbin. The prosperity of Harbin was witnessed by the earliest Jewish merchants and settlers in Harbin. By surveying Harbin's Huangshan Jewish Cemetery, Chinese scholar Zhang Tijiang assessed that Gregory Derrida is the first Jew who came to Harbin. He began his trade along the Songhua River in 1894. He purchased grain and livestock along the Harbin Ash River. Then he shipped and settled and peddled this grain and livestock to Russia and the United States by his own ship. Later, Derrida settled down in Harbin and opened several stores and the Jewish People's Bank on Harbin's Central Street. Therefore, since a very earlier times, Harbin had attracted the Siberian Jewish merchants from the nearby villages to do business in Manchuria by the river. In a word, before the Russians came, numerous villages and populations in all districts of Harbin already existed and developed. Harbin's superior geographical position decides its embryonic form as a modern city. From the Russian side, at the end of the 19th century, industrialization and expansion became the theme of Russia. On the one hand, modernization and urbanization drew Russian people moved to the emerging urban centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. On the other hand, as Russia expanded to the east, the migration to Siberian frontier also began. To facilitate the peopling and the industrial development of ancient Russia, Russia peasants, Poles, and Jews were all encouraged to immigrate to Siberia and the Far East. Russia's railway building accelerated this process of industrialization and immigration. The Trans-Siberian Railway was planned by Russia's Minister of Finance Wade and was approved by the Tsar Alexander III in 1892. The final section of the Trans-Siberian Railway is to connect Russia mainland with Russia's most significant eastern port, Vladivostok, whose name literally means ruler of the east. To emphasize the priority of this railway project, Alexander III appointed his heir, Nicholas, chairman of the Siberian Railways Committee. Now appointing you chairman of the Siberia Railway Committee, I entrust to you the carrying out to the end of this Russian project of peace and enlightenment in the East. However, the Trans-Siberian Railway, this Russian project of peace and enlightenment in the East, as Tsar Alexander III considered it, caused both Chinese and Japanese high vigilance and eventually brought Russia into war. At the very beginning, Qing China was aware of Russia's ambitions to extend to the east, so it refused the Trans-Siberian Railroad going through Chinese land. The Qing government continued to increase the number of Chinese migration to Manchuria. However, after China's defeat in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, alliance with Russia became China's only choice. In return for Russia's guarantee of help in the event of further Japanese aggression, China granted Russia a railway concession cutting through Manchuria, which would shorten about 600-kilometer railway route to connect Vladivostok to Russian mainland, and would strengthen the Russian sphere of influence in the Far East. This railway became known as the Chinese Eastern Railway. The so-called Chinese Eastern Railway was designed by Russia and was used to spread Russia's influence and immigrants from Europe to Siberia, Manchuria, East Asia. Harbin, which was selected as the Russian administrative center of the CER, soon boomed into a modern city. This is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Here is
Ming, show it on the screen because we
Okay.
can't see from the computer.
here is Harbin. This Europe, Russia, Siberia, and Harbin is here. Is Vladivostok is here, Beijing. This is perhaps the longest railroad in the world. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904 against imperialist powers carving up China, Boxer Uprising, which is the Chinese anti-foreigners movement, spread all over China from 1899 to 1901. During the Boxer Uprising, 2/3 of the CER railway was destroyed or damaged. In the name of suppression of the Boxers, Russia sent more than 100,000 troops to Manchuria and occupied the entire Manchuria. However, after the Boxer Uprising was subsided, the Russian army did not withdraw from Manchuria, but attempted to move to Korea. Russia's invasion threatened Japan's interests and security in these areas, which directly caused the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. The so-called Russo-Japanese War actually took place in Chinese Manchuria. The war ended with Russian defeat in 1905. The reason for Russian loss in the war is a historical myth. Some historians saw Russia was overconfident and convinced itself that the Japanese were bluffing and would not ultimately result to war. Another possible reason is that the Tsar was hardly prepared for war at all. All the Russian army was unprepared in organization and supplies. While a few people said it was because of the American Jewish banker Jacob Schiff's financial support to the Japanese army. Nevertheless, the historical consequence, which is certain, is that Russia lost the war, and an important historical effect in our story is that the Russo-Japanese War brought the first large wave of Russian Jewish immigration to Harbin. To fight with Japan, Russia dispatched hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Manchuria day and night through the newly constructed CER, among whom there were more than 30,000 Jewish soldiers recruited from the European Russia. According to Dubonon, these Jewish soldiers and physicians were free to be sacrificed on the battlefield because they hold no government posts. Moreover, the wives and children of the Jewish soldiers were at risk to be expelled from the domicile because the rights of residence were granted to the head of the family as husband or father who had been sent to the war. The long-term oppressive Russian Jewish policies since the 1881 pogroms motivated the Jewish soldiers to leave the impoverished Pale. 2 years of military life in Manchuria made it a familiar place to the Jewish soldiers. During the war, many of them went to pray in the worship place in Harbin. So the first house of prayer was once called Soldiers' Synagogue. Thousands of Jewish soldiers moved to Manchuria and later brought their families with them from Eastern Europe. The number of Harbin Jews increased to about 3,000 in 1906 and later to 6,000 in 1908. The most famous Jewish veteran was Joseph Termpeto, who lost an arm and kept fighting in the Russo-Japanese War. After being released from the Japanese internment in Port Arthur, he had spent some time in Harbin and established a Palestine agricultural cooperative in Harbin, which was the early form of kibbutz. The revisionist Zionist Jewish youth movement, Beta, in Harbin in particular and in the world in general, was named after him. In brief, the Harbin Jewish community, beyond the Dubonon's historical biography, was uprising and becoming the most influential Jewish center in the Far East. At the start of the 20th century, the increasing Jewish immigration brought by the war is one important reason why the Harbin Jewish community could expand and flourish. The foundation of the Harbin Jewish community. On the one hand, Jews came to Harbin for shelter from everywhere in Russia to escape the pogroms, and on the other hand, Jews as well as other immigrations were attracted by the economic opportunities in Harbin, which were brought by the Chinese Eastern Railway. As early as the Trans-Siberia Railroad was being constructed, Siberian Jewish merchants did retail business along the railway to support the railroad workers and the railroad guards. In 1902, about 300 Jews settled in Harbin, with more than 10 Jewish stores opened. At the end of the year, the Jewish residents signed the first formal document, the Protocol of Harbin Jewish Immigrants. And 2 months later, the Harbin Jews registered themselves officially as the Harbin Jewish Spiritual Community. Virtually, it served as a Jewish council, even though it was registered as religious or spiritual organization. The Jewish economic achievements in Harbin were remarkable. The Jewish commercial elite, Skadersky and his family was a successful example among the early explorers in the Far East. Belonging to the upper class of merchants in Ukraine, Skadersky had an optimistic perspective on the economic opportunity in the Far East. In 1903, Skadersky gained the Manchuria forest lodging projects from Qing China government. It is said that about 80% of lumber for the Chinese Eastern Railway's construction were from Sky's family, and their lumber was exported to overseas market as far as Britain. Several years later, when Sky's family finally settled their home in Harbin, they were already members of the first guild and Harbin's only millionaire. A joke in Harbin's local Russian newspaper said that the advertising revenue from Sky was the only hope for the Far Eastern Europe newspapers to sustain. The joke was probably very close to the reality that influential people were easier to be remembered by history. A Talmud Torah school, which was built in Harbin years later, was named after his name, called Sky Talmud Torah School. This is the Sky's home in Harbin. The Jews in Harbin owned after several years' efforts, the Jews in Harbin had owned the large stores, trading firms, and industrial factories. Jewish entrepreneurs dominated in Harbin's manufacture of soybean, flour, cigarettes, beer, and sugar. Harbin Jews were allowed to engage in all kinds of industries without restrictions. Thus, besides the light industries which Jews traditionally engaged in, such as textile and food manufacturers, the Jews in Harbin could participated in some heavy industries, such as the railway building, city building projects, mining, and lodging industries, which were rarely available for Jews in other Russian cities. The Harbin Jews lived in the Russian-controlled railway zone, and they behaved like Russians. They resided next to the Russians, spoke Russian, read the Russian newspapers, and shared the common resource with Russian peacefully. The Jewish institutions sprang up after the war: a synagogue, a Jewish primary school, a theater, a Jewish women's charity, a Jewish club, and a library. Apparently, the Harbin Jews successfully set up an autonomous Eastern European Jewish community in Asia. The Jewish rights in Harbin. This is Isaac, a Manchuria Jew. He is in traditionally Manchuria clothing. Jewish rights in Harbin. Tolerance made Harbin so different from the metropolis of the Pale for minorities fleeing the routinized anti-Semitism of their homeland. According to David Wolf, that 7 of the 32 original members of the Harbin Exchange and 10 of the 40 men who were elected as representatives in the municipal assembly were clear Jewish. The equal political rights and the friendly relations between Jews and the Russian authorities were unheard in Russia. More importantly, the Russian discriminative law limiting Jewish admission to secondary and higher education was absent in Harbin. According to Wolf, in 1913, 14.7% of the combined student body was Jewish. Since the 402 students enrolled represent most of the Jewish children of high school age, we can safely assume that education was available to all who qualified. Esther Houghton, in her memoir, said that her parents chose to move to Harbin from Moscow so their children could attend colleges and universities. Jews enjoyed almost all the civil rights with Russians peacefully in Harbin, in a time when anti-Semitic pogroms were rampant in the Western Russia. There are two reasons why Harbin Jews could enjoy full and equal rights and could live in peace and security and develop their religion freely. One reason is that the Jewish capital and the commercial skills were made use to enhance the Russian economic power in Manchuria. And the other reason is the power of the fanatical Russian Orthodox Church was too feeble to reach the far eastern Harbin. First, the Russian Minister of Finance White and his follower Kokosov renounced the policy intolerance toward foreigners and Jews in Manchuria for Russia's economic interests of this region. Kokosov states that the continuing arrival of new Jews was bringing needed capital. Any curtailment of Jewish rights in the CR zone would have a very uncomfortable effect on the Russian position in Manchuria. And another reason is the declining power of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is the essential reason why Jews could escape the fate of being oppressed in Harbin. The religion's anti-Semitism was not brought to Harbin from Europe, since the decaying Russian Orthodox Church was unable to undertake any missionary work to convert either the Chinese or the Jews and other minorities in Manchuria. In fanatical Russia, state and religion was being slowly separated. For example, several parties in Duma stood for complete religious freedom, such as Constitutional Democratic Party considered that the Orthodox Church and the other faiths must be free from state control. Moreover, the increasing Marxian socialists were opposite to all organized religions, and the peasants and the working man feel the church as an institution were opposite to what many of the people considered to be their own interests. The political influence of the Russian Orthodox Church almost went to the end, actually, during the Russian revolutions since 1905. The religion's tolerance had shaped Harbin as a multi-faith and a multinational city, free from religious restriction and discrimination. Russian Jews in Harbin, like in New York, could openly practice their traditional religions and communal way of life. Jonathan Goldstein called Harbin "No American Golden Medina" for Jews, and some others saw Harbin as an Eastern Zen. In conclusion, when the Chinese Eastern Railway was built in 1890s, Harbin was selected as the center of the railway from Russia to China. Therefore, most of the Eastern European Jews settled in Harbin. Through Harbin, they spread to Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and other parts of China. Thus, in the earlier years, the Russian Jews who came to China were all supported or influenced by the Harbin Jewish community. Moreover, after the Japanese occupied Manchuria, the descendants of the Harbin Jews moved south and enhanced these Jewish communities in China in 1930s. For example, the Harbin Rabbi Levi was invited to be in charge of the Tianjin Jewish community in 1936. Another case is the Harbin Bundist leader, Berman, who had relocated to Shanghai in order to manage that city's office of the American Hebrew Shelter Immigrant Aid Society. Therefore, the survival of Jews in Shanghai during the Holocaust is not an accident. It cannot separate from the half-century of development of the Harbin Jewish Community in China, which was the largest and most influential Jewish center in the Far East before the 1930s. The history of the Harbin Jewish community nowadays has played a significant role in the Israel-China political and economic relationships. That's it.
Thank you very much. I have time, and I would really like to thank the presenters for keeping to the time limit. So please come to the front, Dana and Ming, if you don't mind. And our custom usually is to take a bunch of questions. That typically tends to bring more time, more opportunity for more questions to be heard. So let me collect 3, and then we'll take it from there. I see one. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, the gentleman. That's right.
No, my wife answered my question.
And she wasn't even a presenter. So the gentleman, Doron, and the gentleman in the back, and then we'll take Amir and Ari. Yeah.
Can you shed some light on what happened later in the campaign that moving the Jewish people out of there, the one who remain Jews, and discriminating against the information now in the papers that the Harbin Jewish community, the few, are sort of in danger.
So a question about the Harbin.
If you can shed some light on it.
Doron?
Ironically, that was my question, but I had a question also for you. I guess in your studies that you, looking at the educational systems in Israel, I think from what I understand, there's the secular, the Arab, and the religious. Did you find any differences, especially in the Arab sector, and how that relates? And I also just wanted to add, like, my comment is that history and the way it's taught, even in Quebec, is heavily biased to eliminate all representation of, minorities. So is that something that you noticed or will notice in your study? And just my last question for her, your presentation, which I thought was excellent. What happened to the Jewish community in Harbin after the 1920s and 30s? And did they immigrate like they did in Shanghai?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in the back.
My question is similar to the one previously asked about the Jewish people in Harbin. When they left, did any Jewish people remain in Harbin? And if they did, for how long? And did any marry local people there and raise Jewish Chinese families?
Very interesting. Thank you very much. So, well, Ming was the last one to speak, so let's give her a few more minutes to breathe, to catch her breath. Dana, do you want to take the last question?
Sure. So I should have made it clear in my presentation. So I was specifically looking at secular Jewish schools in Israel, and I was interested in the other schools as well, so I did some research. I found the ultra-Orthodox was most difficult because they're kind of viewed as like the independent stream, and although the Ministry of Education has control over schools in Israel, that sometimes they function kind of outside of the Ministry of Education and they have their own curriculum. So I focused mainly on the secular system, and based on your question whether yes, history is biased in terms of minorities, I did find that obviously, and it's not, as you mentioned, it's not something unique, it's found in other societies as well. And it kind of ties back to what I talked about conflicting and opposing discourses and narratives, and that would be one issue with creating a textbook with a unified narrative, because some scholars have argued that that might be a way to kind of promote peace in the education system, but it's difficult because the narratives are so opposing and contradictory. So in some sense, it makes sense that textbooks are biased in a sense. And there are also issues with Arabs within the Israeli school system and difficulties they've had because they're learning the Zionist narrative, obviously. And I'm also interested in the topic of teachers and how teachers, in a sense, perpetuate and reinforce narratives. which I find is interesting because it's not only the school system itself, but there's the role of teachers as well as parents, so all of these different factors kind of perpetuate the same narratives.
Okay. Thank you, Dana. Ming, you got about 3 questions, so take them in whichever shape or form or order. If you want to take them, if not, we can.
Okay. The 3 questions are little bit related to each other about the after, what happened after. There's in my dissertation, there's 2 parts of the after. It's in the 1920s, when Russia, the Tsar Russia collapsed in 1917. China officially took over this place, took Manchuria and Harbin. So there's no anti-Semitism in China. So the Jewish community developed very well. At the peak, it had almost 20,000 Jews from Russia moved to Harbin. They have a very big community, which is led by Abraham Kaufman and a very famous Rabbi Cloud. And this community developed very well until the 1930s, when the Japanese came. When Japanese occupied the Manchuria, they just do some military work. So most Jews moved to Shanghai. So that's why Shanghai Jewish community could flourish. And some Jews moved to US. And this Harbin Jewish community became a very small Jewish community when Japan occupied this place. And then there's after the state of Israel was founded in 1948, Harbin Jews began to immigrate to Israel. The main Harbin synagogue was closed in 1963, and but at the same time, the Association of Former Residents of China in Israel was founded in 1951 in Tel Aviv. The leader of the Harbin Jewish community, the son of the leader of the Harbin Jewish community, Teddy Kaufman, became the chief editor of the bulletin about the former residents of China in Israel, and they had a very good relationship between Israel and China when China was established in 1949. So even today, Harbin began to actually rebuild the remaining of Jewish buildings, like the synagogue, the Jewish stores. They transferred the Jewish synagogue to the Harbin Museum, Harbin Historical Museum, and it's played a very important role in the economic and political relations between Israel and China nowadays. That's why there's also Jewish studies in Harbin, in Heilongjiang University. That's where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ming. That's great. Can you comment on the Kaifeng question?
Pardon me, I forgot the question.
So the minorities are being kicked out of Kaifeng, and they don't allow Jewish religion and so on. And there are a few core Jews from the old families who kept the Judaism.
Okay, this is just the news in.
It's late years.
Okay, but in the China side, they said we are allowed to the Jews
They don't allow
Judaism
them in Kaifeng.
to flourish in Kaifeng. But their Jewish identity is controversial. I mean, some of them even moved to Israel, but they are not converted to Judaism. They are just like the Gentiles moved to Israel. So the identity of Kaifeng Jews is a problem
I
for
see if I can
themselves.
find the article.
Very interesting. Great. Amir and Alik. Yeah.
Harry.
Oh, Harry. Sorry, I thought. So Amir and Harry, and then if the other is that okay.
My question is for Dana and for Ming. Two questions. The first thing is to Dana, and we talked a little bit about it, but how do you think there is an interrelation between the role of the Arab Jew, another, and the way it interlaces with the role of the Palestinian other? Okay, if there is and I think some of the materials that I sent you say that there is an interrelation there. So that's one question. And for you, Ming, my question is, Harbin is basically an imperial or a European colonizing or a Russian imperial or colonizing effort. Can you think, a little bit widely, what is the role of ethnic minorities of the mother empire in sort of this kind of colonizing, going onto the frontier? Suddenly, you say that suddenly the Pale of Settlement Jews gets all these rights at the far edges of the empire. This new frontier is opened up. So can we talk about something more, the way minorities are treated in imperial projects? Can we say
Russia?
in Russia in general, maybe something more general to imperialism as a whole? Okay.
Great. And Henry.
Thank you to both of you. I have a question for Dana and also for me. I was interested in the, you mentioned also the links to the Israeli Ministry of Education. As you know, it's probably a huge, it's a huge bureaucracy, as many Israelis will question, and the bureaucracy takes pride in the standardization of the curricula and the philosophy of education. I don't know. There was an Israeli film. I don't know if you saw it a few years ago it gently satirized the Israeli Ministry of Education. It centered upon this man who was awarded the Israel Prize, and the prize went to his father, or the prize was supposed to have been awarded to his father, and it was awarded to his son.
Oh, Footnote.
Footnote. That's
That
right.
That
That's
was a
right.
great movie.
It's about academia more.
It's hysterically funny.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know. It's not a coherent question, but I'm just sort of wondering how the idea of the bureaucracy is evolving in Israel, whether there is any sort of move to decentralization and standardization. And also there was something that bothered me too, and that is, to those of us who speak and love Arabic language, we were disturbed a few years ago when Netanyahu banned the Arabic from public signs, for signage, and we found that a kind of evidence for some kind of insecurity, some identity insecurity. And my question is for Ming. First of all, Shusha, very entertaining presentation. What's the word in Chinese for for Jews? I know in Kaifeng it was sinew pullers because of the, the idea of koshering meat. And also did the Jews in Harbin, did they learn Chinese? Did they speak Chinese?
All right, so 2 questions for the 2 presenters. Dana?
So here, you bring up a really good question about the Arab versus the Palestinian, the other, and
The Arab Jew.
and in my dissertation, I kind of spent a section on talking about just the terms themselves and the complexity of using these words. And I found that the Arab case was more difficult, which is why I focus on the Palestinian case, because Israeli Arabs attending school in Israel face difficulties with, a lot of the time, some scholars have talked about the issue of conflicting identities. So what they learn at home from their parents might not necessarily coincide with what they learn at school. And often they raise this with teachers, like, this is not how my parents explained this event or the situation. And teachers are expected to kind of disseminate information based on a certain perspective, based on the curriculum. And what I mentioned before about Arab teachers, that's also interesting, because a lot of the time they recognize this. The students themselves might not realize why there's a disconnect, but they recognize this, and they say a lot of the time they're torn between their loyalties to the state, which provides them, they live in Israel, they're provided with a good job, and also to their identity, which might be Palestinian, and where's like the middle ground between that. And
For many academic Palestinians, this is the only job in Israel.
And
But the state is gonna.
And there was an example at an Arab school where, I think it was an Arab school, where an Arab student was drawing the Palestinian flag, and she said, like, we're supposed to tell them, not to do that. We have a certain curriculum, but she said a lot of the times she'll kind of ignore if students bring up information that might be contradictory or might be confusing, and they're expected to stick to a certain curriculum. And the second question about the bureaucracy. Yes, I agree with that. I think it's a big part, obviously, in Israel. So that's why I talk about public policy as well, because I find that it's very interlinked, the education system and how public policy influences it on a certain level, and how the two fit together. And I was kind of reminded about when Bibi responded to what Kerry said a few weeks ago about his two-state solution, and Bibi, at the end of his speech, he said, we educate for peace and they educate for hate. And I found that really interesting, because there is this push where they talk about, we want to educate for peace, we want there to be peace, but it's difficult in some situations, obviously, when the narrative is one-sided. It's difficult. How do you implement peace when you're not hearing both sides to an extent? So I found that interesting. And also in my presentation, when I talked about looking at different contexts, so the education system 20 years ago versus today. So I looked at when Rabin was prime minister, and different decisions that he made as a leader and how it might have changed or influenced the education system. And interestingly enough is that it hasn't really changed over the years, even though there are leaders from different parties, from right wing, left wing. Overall, it hasn't really changed, and there hasn't been peace. And why is this the case? So that's something I'm interested in also developing through my thesis. Yes.
You mentioned that.
Oops.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, let's just give Ming an opportunity to.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you'll be the next
Okay.
one. Ming.
Okay. First question about the whole picture about the Jews in the empire. It's a very good question because I learned Jewish history, modern Jewish history, especially modern Jewish history here. I learned about the three important section about modern Jewish history is the immigration, Holocaust, and the state of Israel. So my project about the Harbin Jewish Community actually belonged to the immigration part. After 1881, the great Jewish immigration from East Europe to America, mainland America. But a small group actually moved east to Siberia, to the Far East, because of the pogrom, the bad treatment of Jews in the empire, especially the Russian Empire, the East Europe. In my presentation, I also said Russian Jews did not have political and economic and education rights.
Numerous clauses,
Yeah, in Russia, you know.
Right.
That's especially Dubonov talk about it, about the Jewish soldiers were free to be sacrificed in the battle of Russo-Japanese War because they have no rights in Russia. That's why these Jews moved to Harbin and they settled down in Harbin. So that's basically the historical background. Okay, and the section is very interesting. Everyone knows about the Jews in Chinese history, especially the Kaifeng Jews. And in China, Jews is I think it's translated from Jews, 犹太人. In China, Jews is called 犹太.
犹太
Yeah.
Julian.
Yeah.
Judah.
Yeah. That's the Chinese. And they didn't speak Chinese. The Kaifeng Jews speak Chinese for sure, but the Harbin Jews, they don't speak Chinese. They speak Russian. And and only one memoir of a Harbin Jew said he actually married to the Chinese and assimilated to Chinese. This actually the other section of my dissertation. I want to explore if they assimilated to Chinese or not, how they assimilated. That's also in my dissertation, in my research. And another famous example is the former Israel Premier Minister Ehud Olmert. He is a descendant of Harbin Jew.
Yeah, that's what the gentleman was just saying, yeah,
he
was leaving,
Yeah.
Does this mean anything about his later career?
About the gentleman or Ehud Olmert?
No, Ehud Olmert.
Just teasing you up here, just teasing you.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great, thank you. Barbara?
I just wanted to direct one remark to Ming. My mother-in-law grew up in Harbin. We've been in touch, and I'm sorry my husband couldn't stay here because he was born in Tianjin and he was, very much part of that Russian. He was a member of Beitar and all that. But I know from what she told me, speaking about them speaking Russian, that she said nobody ever thought of learning Chinese, but the Chinese who were their servants all learned to speak Russian. She said it was very interesting, and they thought that was perfectly normal. So I guess it was a very imperialistic kind of feeling of the typical colonizing aspect that it shows up in language. Like it's always the first thing. I just wanted to ask Dana. You mentioned just en passant. You mentioned that after the war in Europe, that teaching of history became kind of standardized, and and there was a feeling of inclusion and yada yada and all that. But the big difference is there that the Germany had been soundly defeated. So you were starting an educational system premised on it being settled. The war was settled, the war was over, and you were dealing with historical facts that were not in dispute. Whereas I was a little uncomfortable with your moral equivalency about the two narratives, as if the Zionist narrative was sort of plucked from thin air or something, and the anti-Zionist narrative has equal weight. What we're witnessing now with UNESCO, and we're witnessing a narrative, and I'm sure that the Israeli Arabs are heavily influenced by the narratives that are coming out of the Palestinian Authority and all that, where there's an attempt to totally wipe out or to revisit 3,000 years of history and completely, it's a form of Holocaust denial. It's the same thing. It's history denial, which is a form of anti-Semitism. And I'm sure that in the schools, the Israeli Arab children are quite influenced by their parents or their relatives or hearing all this. So I'm not comfortable with that kind of, on the one hand and on the other hand, as if they were two equally admissible narratives. That does make me uncomfortable, I have to say.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's take maybe, I see Doron, another hand. Do I see any more? No, so Doron, yours is the last question or comment, and then I'll turn it back to Dana and Ming for closing comments, and then I will have some things to tell you.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, I fully agree with what you said. I find it also interesting because when I was in Israel, many Jewish school kids don't visit, come back to, like, they visit Jerusalem once in the time that they go to school. So even among the Jewish, I mean, the secular school system, the way Jewish history is taught is, you know, the role of Jerusalem, and that it leaves something to be desired. So like my expectations are quite low. I mean, you also have within the modern Jewish history, the role of you know, the Jews coming from Arab countries. How much of that is taught in Israeli schools? That's nothing to do with the Arabs. I think that's poorly taught. So, and I bring it back to the question of what goes on here. You know, the bureaucrats in Education Quebec refuse to teach anything with regards to Native Indigenous people, which other provinces do. So the education bureaucrats have managed to convince the governments, both Liberal and PQ, that, you know, Quebec is a victim minority with no input and no influence from its, in other words, the minorities were just oppressors. They had no influence or positive influence. So that directly relates to, like, you talk to many young people that have a negative connotation of Canada, basically on what they learned. So that example, I think, would probably be useful to tell Israeli school teachers that, you know, it's a problem, but they're certainly not unique. And, you know, here I think it's just as bad, if not worse. That's it.
Great. Any closing comments, Dana?
I just want to respond to the first question.
Sure.
So I wasn't trying to say that the two narratives are equivalent. Like in my research, I'm not trying to say which narrative is more factual than the other. I'm just trying to present the facts based on the literature. And I wasn't implying at all that the Zionist narrative was plucked from thin air. I don't believe that it was, and I know that there's thousands of years of history. What I'm just trying to show is that I think that both sides to an extent have legitimate claims, and that there can't be peace without taking the other side into account in some way. And that's basically what I talked about in my presentation, that those three instances, so one of them was instances of blame. That's essentially what both sides are doing, and regardless of who's right and which narrative has more merit, you know, there's no way there can even be negotiation if they're not willing to agree on something, on some sort of claim as legitimate, and if they're not willing to recognize that the other side has even the right to exist or is legitimate, then obviously you can't move forward, and that impacts the education system, obviously.
Thank you. And Ming?
Okay. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my topic, my project, because the Harbin Jewish Community or the Jewish communities in China is a little bit, the history is a little bit on the marginal of modern Jewish history. So I'm very happy I have the opportunity to present my project and get the comments.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the Institute for joining us on this horrible looking gray January afternoon. And I certainly hope that the intellectual meal was at least as appetizing as the pizza that we were able to procure for you today. I do want to leave you with two important pieces of announcement and information, because certainly we are only gearing up for more exciting events during the semester. Next week, on Thursday, January 26th, we are very privileged to welcome and host Professor Yael Aronov from Michigan State University, who is going to be giving a talk based on her recent book, The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers. It's a fantastic study published by one of the premium academic publishers Cambridge University Press. So Yael will be joining us. She will be our guest for 2 days, and I'm particularly delighted to tell you that she is participating. She's visiting us in the framework of the Association for Jewish Studies' Distinguished Lectureship Program. Of course, it was within that framework that we hosted Derek Penslar just a couple of months ago. And fast forward, 5 days thereafter, on Tuesday, January 31st, Professor Jonathan Deckelhem from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem will be visiting us, and he will be giving a talk about the history of Jewish agricultural settlements in 4 continents. Now, the only problem about Jonathan's talk is that he will be visiting my class, which is at 8:45 in the morning. There will be no food, but there will be excited and a little bit sleepy undergraduate students to keep us all awake. But of course, Yael's talk is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right across the street in the hall building. I hope that you can join us for both, or at least one of those 2 events. And if not, we look forward to seeing you thereafter.